Well, the sermon this evening comes from the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 7, and it's verses 1 to 10. So I'm going to read that, give you a second to find it if you have it, and I'll read it to you. It's The Faith of the Centurion. And the title that I've chosen is in line with two others that I preached here a few months ago now, from the Gospels. What true faith looks like. So that's what we're going to think about, the faith of the centurion. So let's read Luke chapter 7, verses 1 to 10. When Jesus had finished saying all this in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. There a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him. This man deserves to have you do this because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue. So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. And that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following him, he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith, even in Israel. Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. I don't know whether any of you ever remember being truly amazed at something. Two such occasions stand out in my mind. The first was at Murrayfield, and I'd gone to watch a player called Jonah Lomu. I don't know whether any of you remember him. He played for New Zealand. He was an 18-stone Maori, which in the amateur days was really huge for a winger. And he'd run 10.4 for the 100 metres. And again, if you know anything about athletics, that is extremely fast and really worthy of Commonwealth Olympic Games. And he recently single-handedly destroyed England. I seem to be talking a lot about England's destruction tonight, but in the World Cup. And I wanted to see him play. I wanted to see what it was like to play against him. So I managed to get tickets through the school to the side of the pitch, and I watched him. I was as close as you could get without actually being on a pitch. And I've never seen anything so extraordinary. I've never seen such extraordinary physical qualities meet in one man. I've never seen anything like it, and I don't think I ever will again. I was amazed, and I still remember that. The other occasion was when I was a young man of 21. I was a student, and I don't need to know why, but I was hiking home from Rome to the south of England. And there was a lorry driver who gave me a lift. And he had absolutely no English, and I had no Italian at all. And we were already at 200 miles or so up the road when I tried to indicate that he should let me off at a certain stop on the map, place on the map, where he was stopping. He mentioned a word. And between us, we agreed that it would be at this place. So after a sort of flurry of pointing and gesticulating, I went off to sleep, because it was quite a way away. And I'll never forget waking up with real alarm, because it was dark, and it was raining. And I could see through the he's supposed to drop me off quite a bit before this. So I was a bit alarmed, and trying to keep calm, I tried to signal that he should let me off, and he just shook his head. He really did not know English, any English, I didn't even know Italian. I was really quite worried, but I had to settle down and await my fate. At one point, he stopped. I thought, I wonder what's going to happen. And I realised, out. So I got out, and I remember standing there looking up and not really knowing what he was doing. And he said, Domodosolo. Domodosolo. This was the place I was headed for. But I realised in a flash that he had driven 100 miles out of his way, dropped his load, that's why we were going so fast, which is alarming, and taken me 100 miles because it was raining, so that he could take me to Domodosolo. It was amazing. I just could not believe it. It's a 200-mile trip that he'd made. I was utterly amazed. I still am talking about it, probably tell. So there are things in this life that do amaze us, and maybe that will help you to remember things that you've been amazed at. But in our story this evening, there is a similar response from Jesus. He is, the word tells us, astonished or amazed. It's not at physical prowess or moral excellence, as with this lorry driver. He's amazed at something else. Verse 9. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following me, he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith, even in Israel. Now, I think that this is the only, I stand to be corrected, but I've looked very carefully at this. I think it's the only recorded example in the Gospels of Jesus being amazed at something admirable. He is amazed at this man's faith. As followers of Christ, I think this should interest us. We talk a lot about wanting to please God, about wanting to live for Him, about wanting to live by faith. And if we really mean it, which I'm sure we do, we will be intrigued by this story, I think. For it must form something of a model for us. What was it, is the question. What was it that Jesus saw in this man and in his faith that provoked such a response? What should true faith look like? Well, 3 chapters on, in chapter 10, verses 25 to 28, we are given direct confirmation of what faith should look like. Because an Old Testament expert comes to Jesus and he says this is by way of just setting the context here before we look carefully at this passage. Luke chapter 10 and verses 25 to 28. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied, how do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. Now the New Testament tells us that the just shall live by faith. But faith is to promote that sort of a standard of life. Love God with all our heart, with our soul, our strength, and our mind. 3 of these things, I think, are clearly evidenced in this story. Heart, soul, and mind. And the strength with which he applies these, and with which he expresses these things, heart, soul, and mind, and then pours into love for his neighbour is very salutary, I think. But what's most astonishing is that they come not from an Israelite who should know what faith looks like, but from a Gentile who one would not expect it from. And this is what amazes Jesus and what he commends at the end of the passage. So we're going to consider these three things briefly tonight. First, a noble heart. This man has a noble heart, and that may surprise you. Where would I begin that from? And what does that have to do with this, that he has a noble heart? Well, I hope it'll become clear. First, how is his noble heart revealed? Verses 2 to 3 tell us. There a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. What we have here is extraordinary. Kindness to his servant. As far as Jesus is concerned, this type of heart is the foundation for all true faith. Now I'm going to say that again, because you'll think, where does that come from? As far as Jesus is concerned, this kind of heart, this nobility of heart, kindness of a centurion for a lowly nobody, a servant, is the foundation for all true faith. Where do we get that from? It comes from Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8, verse 15, and a very common text, which is the parable of the sower. In chapter 8, verse 8, we read this. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up and yielded a crop 100 times more than what was sown. Good soil. Look at verse 15 when he explains this. But the seed on good soil stands for those with a noble and good heart, who hear the word, retain it, and by persevering produce the crop. Great faith starts with greatness of heart. And we may be used to putting it the other way, but it doesn't seem to me we can say anything else if we look at the context in which this is all said. Of course, we know that the Bible tells us that such a heart arises out of the Holy Spirit's action, doesn't it? He tills our hearts. He irrigates our hearts in his good time. He irrigates the soil of our heart that makes them recognize and desire the nobility of Jesus. Our story, I think, indicates that it must have been so with this man. How do we know? Well, consider verses 4 to 5. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him. This man deserves to have you do this because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue. So Jesus went with them. We're told then that he loved the Jewish people. What has this got to do with it? Well, out of this love was born a desire to use his wealth, what he had, to build a synagogue for them. And this can only mean that he had already been drawn to the God of Israel and his people. The God of Israel is entwined with his people. He had surely already been attracted by what he'd heard and seen and been told through his people. He would not have read the scriptures, but I doubt very much he would have known Hebrew. But what he has heard has led him to build a synagogue, where he would have known that these scriptures would have been read and studied, and he would have known that they were the fount of all of how a Jew should have lived and behaved. The only conclusion is that he had already been attracted to the character of God through people in the synagogue. He'd seen evidence of God's fundamental attributes. He must have done. Those attributes which we read of in Micah 6:8. What is it that God requires of you? That you love mercy, act justly, and walk humbly with your God. It's all God requires of us in our practical day-to-day lives. Mercy, compassion, kindness, justice, fairness for all. Whatever the precise truth, both of these qualities are operating here. Something in his heart has began to resonate with these qualities, which combined are what make us noble. We have the expression, it takes one to know one, doesn't it? I think this story says that faith expresses a kinship of heart with God. A kinship of heart. And this man must have had this. Certainly beginning on the right road. To what extent then, we shall have to ask, is this true of all the Christian church? Do we recognize, let alone convey, these qualities of God's character? I think the world, as I see it, is weary for these things. It's weary, it's thirsty for these things. They should find these things in us, just as they would find them in Jesus. We need to note that nothing in Roman philosophy celebrated kindness as a virtue. It didn't. Roman virtues included gravitas, dignity, discipline, courage, but not kindness. Nothing in the Roman army would have taught him this. Slaves were of a lower class, most definitely. A centurion had to come from what was known as the senatorial or the equestrian classes. And all we need to know is that these were the top two classes in Roman society. The slave was of the lowest class. He was a commodity to be used. Now, they weren't necessarily brutal to their slaves, but that relationship was not one of equals, and it certainly did not include, normally, the need to treat their slaves with kindness. Yet this man, we're told in verse 2, valued him highly. He did not despise him. Neither did he despise, by the way, the elders of the Jews, who would have been considered by the Romans as utterly inferior, a conquered people, a subjugated people. Look at Pontius Pilate's response to the Jews, for instance, if you want a picture of how the Romans saw the Jews. Now, this centurion doesn't do that. He doesn't do that to his servant, and he doesn't do that to the Jews. This centurion shows a compassionate, a merciful, and a kind heart. And the question for us as we look at it, the very first question, I feel, as we look at this story, is do we have such hearts? Are faith and kindness inextricably linked in our hearts as they are in his? A heart that leans after the kindness of God is a heart that leans after kindness to our neighbours. George Bernard Shaw, I think, put it very well, sort of Victorian playwright, who says in one of his plays, don't give me that sort of kindness that comes out red hot. Anyone's capable of that sort of kindness. But you give me the sort of kindness that is ice cold. Only that will I accept. And of course, everyone's made to think, because we don't think of coldness as being consistent with kindness. What he means, of course, is that anyone is capable of being kind to people who are nice to us. It's very easy, isn't it, just to do nice things for people who do nice things for us. To coldly practice kindness is to do it very deliberately. Very deliberately. So to treat people who can give us nothing with concern. To value people who can give us nothing. The question is, do we do so? Do we respect or denigrate others? Do we look beyond status to the essential person? That's what Jesus was like. And it seems to me this is what the centurion was like. There was a noble heart, and that should be the same heart as ours. It's a first step. It's a first step. Those people of a noble and good heart, Jesus says, are the good soil. They see something and respond to something that is in God, which they recognize. And we believe he brings that about in them. Of course we do. But the question is, where is that in us? Does it need to be stirred up? Do you need to ask him to do that? This was the first mark, then, I think, of his amazing faith. And secondly, he had, I think, a humble spirit. So, heart, love me with all your heart, a noble heart. With all your spirit, he had a humble spirit. At first, it could appear the opposite, couldn't it? Just look at verse 3. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. Was he scared of associating publicly, we have to ask at this point, with someone of Jesus' class, a lowly Jew, a carpenter? Nobody really. A wandering preacher? Yet, we know, verses 4 to 7, it's the exact opposite. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves you to have to do this because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with him. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you." It's the exact opposite of arrogance and entitlement. It is astonishing, I think, because this Roman centurion considers a Jew, and a carpenter Jew at that, and a wandering preacher at that, as being far above himself. That is extraordinary. He is not worthy to have Jesus in his house. This for a Roman officer was unthinkable. Add to this the fact that his use of messengers is surely evidence also of astonishing tact, and you could certainly read it like that. For a Jewish religious leader to associate publicly with not only a Gentile but a military occupier would have been anathema to everyone else. So maybe there is also a sensitivity here. But for a Roman soldier to acknowledge this and to treat people with such tact is just extraordinary. Grace and humility then. Grace of tactfulness. The humility of knowing he's not worthy. He's not a good enough person to have Jesus. Grace and humility are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. Humility is not obsequious, cringing behavior. And we often think of that. Charles Dickens very famously had this character in one of his most famous novels, David Copperfield. And he's gone down in history as the sort of symbol of false humility. Uriah Heep, I'm ever so humble, and he wipes his hands, and of course he's absolutely the opposite. He's absolutely the opposite. He keeps saying that. And of course, more humorously, Oscar Wilde famously defined another sort of humility. Humility, he said, is the art of getting everybody else to know about your achievements without actually telling them. Well, we can all be like this. That's not humility. We know what humility is. The passage shows us true humility, a true acknowledgement of ourselves in relation to God. That's what it is. And as such, it's the foundation of sincerity, isn't it? This centurion expresses it clearly in verses 6 and 7. "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof." There's no reason for us to suppose this man to have been especially wicked would make him think that. Although to have attained such a rank, he must have had considerable experience of the army and all that life in the Roman Empire entailed. But all we know for certain is that when he compared himself to Jesus, he felt very small and unworthy. And this is very reminiscent in Luke's Gospel of Peter's response 2 chapters earlier, when he says in chapter 5, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." Is that our response to the presence of Jesus? It ought to be. And perhaps when we consider it, most problems in the church, local and worldwide, are caused because we know little of humility. If we know nothing of this sense of smallness in relation to God, in relation to Christ, it means we've never truly seen Jesus, let alone loved him with all our soul. It is seeing him, surely, that actually brings true perspective on ourselves. When we truly see him, it reveals very sharply, doesn't it, all our silly pomposity and our pettiness, our silly self-preoccupation, our petty need for power, our greed, our lust, our weakness. And we need to be continually remembering this. This is why we have Sunday worship. This is why we meet together midweek. This is why we read our Bibles. We've got to continually be reminded of who we are, who God is, and what Christ has done for us. This surely is what the centurion has already recognized in himself as he studied and observed Jesus. And this was the second mark then of this amazing faith, a humble soul. So it is astonishing. A noble heart that responds to the noble Jesus, the miraculous Jesus, of course, but a humble soul also that recognizes that he is not worthy to be on the same level. And then finally, a discerning mind. If his heart is the good soil that directs him to God, and his soul and spirit have put him in the right perspective to God, it is his mind that brings him finally to this great statement of faith. He says in verse 7, this is the statement of faith, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. What a truly astonishing statement. Where does this come from? Verse 8 tells us, listen to verse 8. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I tell this one, go, and he goes. That one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. He has observed Jesus, and he sees a comparison. He has observed Jesus, and as a result of his observation, he has reached the conclusion with his mind that Jesus has the authority to heal anyone with a word. This is astonishing, but it does reveal the basis of true faith. Jesus, we need to remind ourselves, or we need to realize, has been in Capernaum before. He has done miracles there. A couple chapters earlier, chapter 4, he has driven out an evil spirit from a man. He has healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law. He has healed countless numbers with various kinds of sickness. And John chapter 4 adds something. John adds that in Capernaum he had healed the son of a royal official who lived in Capernaum by a word only. You may go, he says to the official. Your son will live. This has got to have got round. This is surely the basis of the centurion's faith. If he has been stationed there, which he clearly is, he will surely have heard of all these incidents. He will be especially aware that the royal official's son was healed in exactly the way he is asking Jesus to heal his servant, with a word. He has seen, he has heard, he has believed. To restore health immediately with only a word. If he is a lover of the Jews, he must know that the only one with such a unique quality is God himself, who can bring life with a word, who created light by saying, let there be light. This is what he has seen in Jesus. This is, I think, his faith. And what about us? What's this got to do with us? Well, it's got this to do. A man, a Jew, comes and dies and rises again, and we believe him. We believe it. It's an incredible thing. We believe it. Why? Because another set of criteria overrules our incredulity. In our minds, we observe Jesus in the Gospels. We note the tone of those who tell us about him. We note their preoccupation with truth. We know what happened to them because of their allegiance to this incredible truth. And they would not give it up. And we find it impossible to dismiss them or him as liars or charlatans. And that is why we believe. One thing more. He discerns true authority in Jesus. Did you notice that? He knows what authority is. He commands roughly 100 soldiers. He himself is under the direct command of the governor of Judea. And beyond him, the tribunes, the consuls, and the senators of Rome, and even the emperor himself. He is under authority. He knows what authority is, and he has authority. He knows then true authority when he sees it. True authority cannot be assumed, pretended at. It is natural. It is authentic. We do know it when we see it. Chapter 4 tells us that everybody had seen this in Jesus. It says in verse 32 of chapter 4, they were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority. That's how one version puts it. He taught as one who had authority, and they saw this. An authoritarian person is different. An authoritarian person often lacks true authority. The insistent on petty rules, the hectoring, the bullying, or they're all a sign, aren't they, often of insecurity. A sign that a person is conscious that without these things, others will never follow him or her. But Jesus is not only full of command, he is full of kindness. He's full of other people. He serves other people. He associates with lesser people. And he is himself in no way diminished by this. He is unthreatened. He has true authority, and men could see it, and women could see it. Precisely because of, not despite his Roman rationalism, the centurion accepts that Jesus is no huckster, he's no charlatan. There is something about him that really does indicate he can heal with only a word. He is unlike any other man, however unlikely that might appear. And so it turns out, verse 10, the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. Luke does not even mention that Jesus says anything. That's what the man asked for. Just say it with the word. Luke doesn't mention that he says anything. Matthew does say that he tells them to go and it will be done. But in neither account do we have Jesus actually saying anything approaching a word to say, be healed. So he said it in there, hasn't he? So faith in this centurion is marked by that great quality which Jesus has confirmed earlier. Not just a noble heart, not just a humble soul, but a discerning mind. With all three of these, he comes to Jesus and gives him true worship, I think. These together express the essence of this man's faith. Jesus recognizes it. And what about us? Do we recognize in Jesus what the centurion recognized? Are our hearts good soil that know a humble man when we see him, but know a noble man when we see him, because there's something in our hearts that is kin with that? Are our souls humble? Are our minds discerning of his authority? Not only his authority to create and recreate with a word, but finally, of course, his authority to forgive sins. Do we love God with all our heart and soul and mind? And do we practice this love with all our strength? And does it transform into loving our neighbour with that sort of love as we love ourselves? It should do. That's what faith seems to be. We need to be refreshed in such faith, don't we? I do. I do. I am as I look at this. And we're first of all humble, aren't we, by it? But if we're to bring others to such faith, if we're to do any good in the world, that's the sort of faith that we need. So let's ask that God will grant that we are all refreshed. But this evening, I hope, somehow with contact with each other through this day, and that we may go forth in this week in true faith, for our own sake, for the sake of our friends, and for the sake of the world.